when you're talking about sports, it's interesting because, of course, you have different standards. I mean, right now, one of the things that we're doing with the Nike project, and GLAAD is part of the LGBT Sports Coalition, one of the things that we're working on is getting all states to adopt, a trans-inclusive sports policy, or what we call the Washington State Standard, because where you're allowed to compete on the basis of identity. You're under the care of a doctor. Your parents will verify that this is your gender identity, and you get to compete on that basis. There's huge controversy, of course, in that very issue in California right now that has led to the whole SB 1266. But on the other hand, a state like Illinois, IHSA very quietly adopted those standards, or effectively. We're still working on tweaking the language, but Illinois is one of the states that's on the side of the angels from my perspective in terms of saying kids are going to be allowed to compete, and coaches are going to have to be ready for that. We still don't have lots. It didn't lead to this tidal wave of boys trying to compete as girls, looking for try to turn life into a Porky shower scene or something. I mean, it's that didn't happen. No matter how much IFI or those kinds of clowns will talk about that stuff, it's this doesn't happen. This is just about people's real lives and real solutions, not turning everything into a Porky's movie. But that said, obviously there is always going to be a little bit of pushback, and really, whether you're talking about trans athletes who are allowed to compete in the Olympics, for instance, the IOC has already made space for trans people. And this goes kind of back to the complicated history of trans athletes competing in the Olympics back in 1932 and 36, which isn't really necessarily something the Olympics can or should brag about, because whether it was in 1936 and the Nazis basically put a guy in a dress and said he's going to compete in women's events to help run up our medal total, and that was he claimed against his will. This isn't a great moment in LGBT history, but the Olympics do have standards to include at transgender athletes. They have had transgender athletes compete now, and that's an important message. The NCAA is already, again, they've got messaging on this, and they're already accepting trans athletes. And if, in some ways, when you're talking about a basketball player like Kai Allams when he came out, I mean, one of the basic problems when you're talking about trans athletes is almost always going to end up being about testosterone, because in one gender that's considered a performance-enhancing drug, and so what do you do when you're talking about a female-to-male transgender athlete? Kai, came out as trans, but before he could start using testosterone and actually acting on his gender identity, he, if he was going to continue competing with the women's basketball team, he could not take testosterone. Now, if he had been taking testosterone, I think it's an interesting proposition is, when are we going to see our first female-to-male trans athlete competing with men while on testosterone? Is that going to fly? Again, so in some ways, this is something that is terra incognita, and we're going to be making it up as we go along. Just as we had to when Kai came out, or when Gabby Ledwig came out and she started playing college basketball or community college basketball out in California just last year. It really is kind of how adaptive are human institutions to the existence of something that they totally didn't anticipate. And in that, it's a lot like law. I mean, where, it's not like the founding fathers expected us to come along. It certainly didn't include, that's why, we're going to have legal efforts in every state, whether it's anything from public accommodations all the way to, can I amend my birth certificate? That's something that, again, none of these organizations, no statewide body was ever created with trans people in mind, which forces us to basically negotiate and fight for our rights in one way or another and achieve them. But, I think our goal, to take it back to, particularly when you're talking about trans youth and competing in sports, is, certainly my goal in terms of my activism is to make sure I want a trans kid to have a childhood. I don't want a trans kid to end up in a situation where they basically have to sue for the right to have a childhood the same as every other kid. I just want them to be able to have the same childhood that everybody else takes for granted.
So we have just a little bit of time left, so I want to make sure we get some time for some additional questions. So.
Hi, you hinted earlier about wanting to leave a good impression with your employers, and I was wondering about a question, whether it thinks it also takes a bit of patience on your part. Because I know from my own experience transitioning, I'd worked with these people for 3 years, and so when they were talking about me in meetings, they would sometimes go he, And I didn't get persnickety about it, although internally I wanted to. It was sort of, okay, fine, we. And it took them about 3, 4, 5 months before they stopped doing that. Was that the same in your experience? Were you lucky? Did they immediately manage to get that and get them off?
In my previous job, there were definitely some issues, but again, I would say it's like, how do you respond to it? And that's it's a tough thing for any one of us to have to deal with if you're trans, because like I would almost always try to make light of it, or like, yeah, what'd you do there? What'd you do there? And like make fun of them for getting it wrong, as opposed to sitting there and getting upset and visibly upset and angry and letting that be the predominant emotion. As much as it sucks to have to be a comedian professionally then in that circumstance, or to basically try to deflect it, to shame them in a way that doesn't make you look like the jerk who's like defensive and reactive, and it's tough, but that's where I found the most effectiveness was basically to and also to help it make sense as a trans person to kind of cultivate a couple of allies in the office who are also going to help you police these things for you. So like the fact that I had a bunch of girlfriends in the office who I was out to before I came out to the entire office was important, because then in terms of office response, I had a group of people who already knew what they were going to say and were already positive in terms of saying like, no, this is going to be cool. Basically reassure all the boys who were busy freaking out, like, it's going to be okay and you'll get over it, and like, this is no reason to freak out. That was important, but that was, again, kind of anticipating or about the office diplomacy that would have to follow. But again, I'm just thinking about it, and I always kind of like laugh about it, because going back to my first interview at ESPN when they called me out of the blue, 90 minutes into that interview before I brought up the issue of being trans and said, so you guys know, so do you have an issue? And they're like, no, why would we care? We're hiring you for you and your resume. We want you as a working professional. And like I said, none of the boys, none of whom none of whom are gay, all of them, but just straight white boys, age 40 and up, like none of them had needed a teaching moment, so to speak, on the whole idea of being LGBT. Some of them are outspokenly supportive of me in my activism, but generally speaking, I mean, again, this is a bunch of guys who, from all walks of life, who are only unified by their profession and interest in baseball, and they yet to even get a pronoun wrong, which I'm still just sort of like, I don't know if it's a Disney thing, I don't know if it's like, like we're all whistling while we work or what, but my guys have been awesome.
Have any other questions?
Hi. You said that you were just kind of intrinsically gifted with an interest and passion in sports, and that was your calling. And I'm kind of transitioning at a transitioning moment in my early career, and I just was wondering kind of what motivated you in the beginning of your career. Like, was it always that way? And then after you came out or transitioned, if you felt more courage or more determination to kind of get more involved?
In sports? Or?
Just kind of in your career, I guess, finding your passion.
Well, I think like almost anybody, or in a significant number of American families, I mean, like, watching football with Dad on Sunday was just automatically part of my childhood, and is the part of my nephews and nieces and childhoods as well, when they spend time with Grandma and Grandpa, or like watching football, watching college football on Saturday and pro football on Sunday, and watching ball games. I mean, I'm old enough that like I didn't get to see a lot of ball games on TV as a kid. I was listening to it on the radio when I was out on the farm, like doing chores, and so like I'd have the radio cranked up to 11, and like just so I could hear the play-by-play for the A's or the Giants, because I grew up in Northern California. That was just part of what was expected. But for me, sports weren't gendered, because I grew up on a horse ranch. My dad doesn't ride. My mom taught me how to ride. So my mom not only taught me how to make marinara from scratch, she also taught me how to ride a horse. So my perspective on genders and gendering and like who's tough and who's not, like I know some pretty tough women who can bust a colt in no time. That's pretty badass. Learning how to do that myself is pretty badass. But like that's something where the idea that sports aren't segregated by gender, and that people can be tough in either gender, or people can do athletic activities and be mentors or role models in either gender. The first gay man that I met outside of family was one of my trainers, and Dennis is still a competitive rider. He was an Olympic alternate and an OAS team. I mean, but coming from a particularly privileged, background in that sense, that like I had that kind of exposure, and I just thought. But even in like my flag football team in grade school, we had the first girl playing on our team, and Corey's parents had to sue for their daughter to have a right to play the flag football team. It was awesome that Corey got to compete because we won. Corey was our quarterback. And she was an amazing athlete at 11 years old or whatever. And and there are few sports memories for me personally more satisfying than walking off the field after we beat the Cowan Cowboys. Kenneth Avenue Cougars all the way. But when we beat the Cowboys, and one of the boys on the Cowboys is sobbing, he is in tears, and his father is consoling him with, "Well, it's okay. They cheated. They had a girl." That's okay.
Does that answer your question? Are there any other questions? And we've got just a few more minutes. Okay, so I have a couple more. Look to the future. Who's going to win the American League pennant this year? Next year?
I still don't know who's on all the teams yet. I mean, one thing as an American League West fan or as an Oakland A's fan, I'm glad is that it looks like the Rangers are going down in flames, and that's okay because I don't mind that, and I don't mind that the Angels aren't looking so tough, and I don't think Robinson Cano is going to make a big difference with the Mariners. So as an A's fan, even though I'm not supposed to have a rooting interest, I'm like already thinking pretty good about my guy's chance to win the third division.
So is that a commitment? Is that a commitment on who's going to win?
I'll commit to the Oakland A's winning the AL West. So.
Okay. All right.
I am not going to commit to the White Sox winning the AL Central. I'm sad to say.
And the National League? I mean, you're the one with all the stats here. You should be able to kind of come up with this.
You can't forecast if you don't have an incomplete roster. So
right.
I suspect we will not see a Cubs flag flying, I don't think you have to have a background in sabermetrics or performance analysis. In fact, I think Theo would be the first to agree that there will not be a pennant flag flying over Wrigley Field at the end of the season.
Will Wrigley Field even be there, right? I mean, in the process of renovating everything.
Oh, no, it'll be there.
Well, thank you. I just want to, if there are any other questions, thank you so much. I mean, I've learned a tremendous amount from you, and just it's been a pleasure to get to know you, and I know you'll be around, and people can, if you're shy and you want to ask questions individually. So anyway, a round of applause for Christina Kahrl.